At the 100th anniversary party of our family company, my husband's colleagues laughed and mocked me. "How does it feel being a failure? Your husband earns the money and you just spend it." My husband laughed and agreed. "That's how things should be." I smiled, pulled him by the arm, and made an announcement. "Tell me, how does it feel knowing the useless woman owns 73% of the company?" The entire room went pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I should have known something was wrong the moment Byron insisted I wear the blue dress. Not the navy one I preferred, but the powder blue monstrosity he'd bought me for our anniversary 3 years ago, the one that made me look like an aging prom queen. "You want to look appropriate tonight, Beulah," he said, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "This is the company's 100th anniversary. Important people will be there." Important people. As if I hadn't been married to him for 42 years. As if I hadn't attended every single company function since we were newlyweds. But I put on the dress anyway, applied my lipstick, and followed him to the car like the dutiful wife I'd been trained to be. The ballroom at the Riverside Hotel was decorated with gold and burgundy banners celebrating Morrison Family Enterprises' centennial. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables filled with executives, board members, and their spouses. Everyone looked polished, successful, important. Byron immediately gravitated toward his usual crowd, the younger executives who treated him like some kind of mentor. I found myself standing alone by the bar, nursing a glass of white wine and watching the festivities from the sidelines. That's when I heard it. The laughter. "Look at her over there," one of Byron's colleagues said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "How does it feel being such a failure, Beulah? Your husband makes all the money and you just spend it." The speaker was Derek Hutchins, the vice president of operations, a man barely 40 years old with slicked back hair and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. Around him stood 3 other executives, all grinning like they'd just heard the funniest joke of their lives. My face burned with embarrassment, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice had taught me how to swallow humiliation with a smile. "That's harsh, Derek," laughed Michael Torres from accounting. "But let's be honest. What does she even do all day? Shop? Get her nails done? Must be nice living off someone else's hard work." The group erupted in more laughter. Other guests began to notice the commotion, turning to stare. I felt dozens of eyes on me, some curious, others pitying. A few wives looked away uncomfortably, as if my shame might be contagious. But the worst part was yet to come. Byron, my husband of 4 decades, the man who promised to honor and cherish me, threw back his head and laughed louder than anyone else. Boys," he said, wiping his eyes. "You're being too kind. At least she's good at spending money. That takes some skill, right?" He looked directly at me, his eyes cold and amused. "That's how things should be. I work. She spends. It's the natural order." The words hit me like physical blows. Not just the cruelty of them, but the casual way he delivered them, as if I were nothing more than an expensive pet he kept around for appearances. I stood there frozen, my wine glass trembling in my hand. Around me, the conversation continued, each comment more degrading than the last. "At least she looks the part," someone said. "The perfect corporate wife. Silent and decorative," added another. "Just how they like them." "I bet she doesn't even know what the company actually does," Derek chimed in. "Probably thinks Morrison Family Enterprises makes pretty dresses or something." More laughter, more staring, more humiliation piling on top of humiliation until I thought I might suffocate under the weight of it all. But then something inside me shifted, something that had been building for years, maybe decades. A quiet rage that had been simmering beneath my carefully maintained surface. I set down my wine glass and walked toward the group. My heels clicked against the marble floor with each deliberate step. Conversations around me began to fade as people sensed something was about to happen. "Byron," I said sweetly, reaching for his arm. My voice carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Darling, could you come here for a moment?" He looked surprised, but allowed me to guide him to the center of the room. The executives followed, still grinning, expecting another opportunity to mock me publicly. I cleared my throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Since we're all being so honest tonight," I began, my voice steady and clear, "I have something I'd like to share with everyone." Byron's expression shifted slightly. Something uncertain flickered in his eyes. "Derek asked me how it feels to be a failure," I continued, turning to address the room. "Michael wondered what I do with my time, and my dear husband here thinks I'm just good at spending money." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People moved closer, sensing drama. "Well," I said, smiling at each of their confused faces, "let me ask you something in return. How does it feel to know that the useless woman you've all been laughing at owns 73% of Morrison Family Enterprises?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's mouth fell open. Michael's face went white. Byron stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "That's impossible," Byron whispered. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded document. "Would you like to see the ownership papers? They're all perfectly legal and up to date." The color drained from Byron's face entirely. Around us, the crowd buzzed with shock and confusion. Board members who had been treating me like furniture for decades suddenly looked at me with new eyes. "You see," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "while you've all been assuming I was nothing more than a decoration, I've been the one keeping this company afloat. Every major decision, every strategic move, every financial approval, it all goes through me." Byron reached for the papers with shaking hands. "This can't be real." "Oh, but it is," I replied. "And now that we've cleared that up, I think we need to have a very different conversation about who exactly has been failing whom." The room erupted into chaos as the full implications of my revelation began to sink in. But for the first time in 40 years, I felt perfectly calm. The ride home was silent except for the hum of the engine and Byron's heavy breathing. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His jaw clenched in a way I hadn't seen since our early marriage, when he still bothered to show anger instead of indifference. "Explain," he said finally as we pulled into our driveway. His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. I waited until we were inside the house before answering. 42 years of habit made me automatically hang up his coat and set my purse on the hall table before walking into the living room we'd redecorated 5 times over the decades. "There's nothing to explain, Byron. Everything I said was true." He followed me, loosening his tie with jerky movements. "That's impossible. I would have known. The lawyers would have told me. The board would have." "The board reports to me," I interrupted quietly. "They always have." He stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "Beulah, this is insane. You don't know anything about business. You've never even looked at a financial statement." I almost laughed at that. Instead, I walked to our bar cart and poured myself a glass of brandy. My hands were steadier than they'd been all evening. "Sit down, Byron. It's time you learned some family history." He remained standing, too agitated to settle. "What family history? Your parents were middle-class nobodies. My grandfather built this company from nothing." "Your grandfather," I said, taking a sip of brandy, "was about to lose everything when I met you. Morrison Family Enterprises was hemorrhaging money. The textile mills were outdated, the equipment was falling apart, and the bank was 3 months away from foreclosure." Byron's face went pale again. "That's not true. Grandfather was successful. He left me a thriving business. He left you a beautiful facade hiding a rotting foundation." I sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window where I'd spent countless evenings pretending to read while actually reviewing quarterly reports Byron thought came from his accountants. In 1982, when we got married, Morrison Family Enterprises was carrying debt of over $2 million. The company employed 400 people who were about to lose their jobs. Your grandfather was having chest pains from the stress, and your father had already started drinking himself to death over the shame of it all. Byron sank onto the couch across from me. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because my middle-class nobody parents weren't quite as humble as I let you believe." I swirled the brandy in my glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "My father owned Patterson Industries, steel manufacturing primarily. But he had investments in textiles, automotive parts, and real estate. When he died 6 months before our wedding, he left me everything. The silence stretched between us. Byron's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. $12 million, I continued. That's what I inherited. Not a fortune by today's standards, but substantial enough in 1982. Especially for a 24-year-old woman who everyone assumed was marrying above her station. 12 million, Byron repeated faintly. I could have walked away, you know. When I discovered the true state of Morrison Family Enterprises 3 weeks before our wedding, I could have called everything off. Found myself a nice banker or lawyer who could support me in the style I was accustomed to. I met his eyes. Instead, I decided to save your family's legacy. Byron's voice came out as a whisper. Save it how? Quietly? Anonymously. I had my father's lawyers set up a series of shell companies and investment vehicles. Over the course of our first 5 years of marriage, I systematically bought out Morrison Family Enterprises' debt, modernized the equipment, and restructured the entire operation. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf where Byron kept his collection of golf trophies. Behind them, hidden from casual view, was a small leather portfolio I'd placed there years ago. The fascinating thing about shell companies, I said, retrieving the portfolio, is that they can be very useful for maintaining privacy, especially when you want to help someone without damaging their pride. I handed him the portfolio. These are the original incorporation papers. Patterson Holdings, Patterson Investments, Patterson Family Trust, all established between 1982 and 1987, all registered under my maiden name. Byron's hands shook as he opened the folder. Patterson. Your maiden name was Patterson. Patterson Industries was the silent partner that saved Morrison Family Enterprises. What you thought was a business loan from the bank was actually my money. What you believed were new investors interested in textiles were my shell companies. What you assumed was your grandfather's brilliant financial recovery was me pumping millions of dollars into a dying business. I returned to my chair and watched as Byron's world crumbled around him. 40 years of believing himself a successful businessman. 40 years of thinking he'd inherited his grandfather's acumen. 40 years of treating me like an ornamental accessory. But why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were so proud. So convinced that you were taking care of me, rescuing me from my humble circumstances. You loved being the successful husband married to the grateful little wife. I didn't want to take that away from you. The truth was more complicated than that, but I wasn't ready to share everything yet. I wasn't ready to tell him about the conversations I'd overheard between him and his friends before our marriage. The ones where he'd joked about marrying beneath his station, but how it would be worth it because I'd be so grateful I'd never cause him any trouble. So all these years? Byron's voice trailed off. All these years, I've been the majority shareholder. Every major business decision crossed my desk. Every expansion, every acquisition, every strategic partnership. I approved them all. The executives you think report to you? They actually report to me. The board meetings you thought you were leading? I was pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Byron set the portfolio down with trembling hands. The other wives, they knew? I almost smiled at that. The other wives knew exactly what I wanted them to know, that I was Byron Morrison's devoted spouse who spent her days shopping and planning dinner parties. They envied my life because they thought it was carefree and luxurious. They had no idea I was working 80-hour weeks managing a multi-million-dollar company. Working where? How? I never saw you. The home office upstairs that you think is my craft room? That's where I handle Morrison Family Enterprises business. The book club I attend every Tuesday, board meetings, the spa days I take once a month, financial planning sessions with our accountants and lawyers. Byron looked around our living room as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze lingered on details he'd never noticed before. The second phone line I'd had installed for personal calls, the locked filing cabinet I'd claimed was for recipes and household records, the expensive laptop I'd told him was for email and online shopping. Every lie, he whispered. Our entire marriage has been built on lies. Not lies, Byron. Protection. I protected your pride, your reputation, and your family's legacy. I made sure you could hold your head high at every business function, every golf tournament, every social gathering. I made sure Morrison Family Enterprises not only survived but thrived. I finished my brandy and set the glass down with a soft clink. What I didn't protect myself from was the humiliation, the condescension, the casual cruelty you and your colleagues have been showing me for decades. Tonight, when you laughed along with them calling me a failure, something inside me finally broke. Byron buried his face in his hands. Beulah, I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I had known. If you had known, what? You would have treated me with respect? You would have acknowledged my contributions? You would have defended me when your friends attacked me? I shook my head. No, Byron. You would have found other ways to diminish me, because the problem was never that you didn't know about my capabilities. The problem was that you never bothered to look for them. We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Byron looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What happens now? I smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Now, Byron, you're going to learn what it really means to work for Morrison Family Enterprises, because as of tonight, the pretense is over. The next morning, Byron left for work without his usual goodbye kiss. Not that I minded. I had more pressing matters to attend to than his wounded pride. I waited until his car disappeared down our tree-lined street before making my way to what he still believed was my craft room. The space on the second floor had been my sanctuary for decades. While Byron thought I spent my time up there scrapbooking and arranging flowers, I'd actually been running a $50 million enterprise from behind an antique sewing table that doubled as my desk. I unlocked the filing cabinet he'd never questioned and pulled out a thick folder marked Personnel, Executive Level. It was time to take a closer look at the people who'd been so eager to humiliate me last night. Starting with Derek Hutchins. What I found in Derek's file made my stomach turn, not just the expected performance reviews and salary information, but a series of expense reports that painted a disturbing picture. Dinner charges at expensive restaurants on nights when he claimed to be in client meetings. Hotel bills for weekend business trips that had no corresponding conference or customer visit records. And most telling of all, a pattern of Friday afternoon emergency meetings that required him to leave the office early. I cross-referenced his expense reports with the company credit card statements I reviewed monthly. The pattern became clear immediately. Derek had been using company funds to finance an affair, submitting fraudulent expense reports for what were obviously personal romantic getaways. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering who his affair partner was. I pulled up the personnel files on my computer and began comparing dates. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, travel expenses, all matched perfectly with another employee's schedule. An employee who had been receiving suspicious bonuses and raises despite mediocre performance reviews. Sandra Chen, Byron's executive assistant for the past 15 years. My hands trembled as I printed out the evidence. Sandra, the woman who had organized every one of Byron's business trips. Sandra, who had access to his calendar, his email, his private phone line. Sandra, who had been in our home dozens of times for work-related meetings and holiday parties. Sandra, who was 38 years old, unmarried, and had been receiving salary increases that far exceeded her actual contributions to the company. I leaned back in my chair, feeling sick. Not because Byron was having an affair. I'd suspected that for years. But because of how stupid he'd been about it. Using company resources, creating a paper trail, putting Morrison Family Enterprises at legal risk for his personal indulgences. And then I found something that made everything infinitely worse. Hidden in Sandra's employment file was a memo dated 6 months ago. A promotion request that Byron had submitted to Human Resources, recommending Sandra for a newly created position, Director of Executive Operations. The salary he'd proposed was $120,000 annually, plus profit-sharing benefits. The memo included a justification paragraph that made my blood run cold. Ms. Chen has demonstrated exceptional dedication to the executive team and deserves recognition for her contributions. Her intimate knowledge of company operations and personal commitment to excellence make her invaluable to Morrison Family Enterprises. I strongly recommend immediate approval of this promotion and compensation package. Intimate knowledge, personal commitment, The language was deliberately suggestive, almost mocking. But the most infuriating part was the signature line at the bottom of the memo. Byron had forged my signature on the approval form, assuming I would never see it because I was just the decorative wife who didn't involve herself in business matters. I printed out everything and created a timeline. The affair had been going on for 15 years, almost from the moment Sandra was hired. Byron had been systematically promoting her, increasing her salary, and giving her access to confidential company information. He'd even listed her as his emergency contact on several business documents, claiming it was for convenience. My phone rang, interrupting my investigation. The caller ID showed Byron's office number. Beulah? His voice sounded strained. We need to talk. Can you come to the office? I'm busy, I replied calmly. What do you need? I've been thinking about last night, about what you told me. Maybe we can work something out, some kind of arrangement. An arrangement. As if 42 years of marriage and the financial salvation of his family's company was something that could be negotiated like a business contract. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind, Byron? Well, obviously you've been more involved in the business than I realized. Maybe it's time for you to take a more official role. We could announce you as a consultant or advisor, give you an office, a title, make it legitimate. I almost laughed. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about recognition, about wanting my name on a door or business cards. He had no idea that I'd been pulling the strings all along, that his entire career had been an elaborate performance I'd been directing from the shadows. That's very generous of you, Byron. Tell me, have you discussed this arrangement with Sandra? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I'm not sure what you mean. Sandra Chen, your executive assistant, the woman you've been having an affair with for 15 years, the woman you've been promoting and giving raises to using forged authorization forms. That's Sandra. Another long silence. Then, barely audible. How did I know? I finished for him. Byron, I review every expense report, every personnel file, every financial transaction this company makes. Did you really think you could hide an affair that you've been financing with corporate funds? I heard him take a shaky breath. Beulah, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You've been embezzling money to finance your relationship with Sandra. You've been giving her promotions she didn't earn and salary increases she didn't deserve. You've been putting Morrison Family Enterprises at legal risk for sexual harassment and financial misconduct. And you've been doing it all while treating me like an ignorant housewife who couldn't possibly understand business matters. It's not embezzlement, Byron said weakly. I'm an executive. I have discretionary spending authority. Discretionary spending for business purposes, not for romantic weekends in Napa Valley. Not for jewelry purchases at Tiffany's that you claimed were client gifts, not for apartment rent payments disguised as consulting fees. I'd found all of it, every fraudulent expense report, every suspicious transaction, every lie he'd told to cover his tracks, 15 years of evidence that could destroy him personally and professionally. What do you want? He asked finally. What I want, I said, standing up and walking to the window overlooking our perfectly manicured garden, is for you to understand that your arrangement offer is completely backwards. You're not offering me a role in my own company, Byron. You're begging me not to destroy your career and send you to prison. Through the window, I could see our neighbor Mrs. Patterson working in her rose garden. She was probably close to my age, maybe a few years older, but she moved with the confidence of a woman who'd never had to hide her intelligence or pretend to be less capable than she was. I envied her that freedom. Prison? Byron's voice cracked. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery, sexual harassment. You've created quite an impressive criminal portfolio over the past 15 years. The legal fees alone would bankrupt you, even if you somehow avoided jail time. Beulah, please, we can work this out. I'll end things with Sandra. I'll pay back any money you think was misspent. We can go back to the way things were, As if I would ever again pretend to be the grateful, ignorant wife while he made a fool of me behind my back. As if I would continue to finance his lifestyle and his affair while he publicly humiliated me. The way things were is over, Byron. What happens next depends entirely on how cooperative you're willing to be. Cooperative with what? I smiled, though he couldn't see it. With helping me clean house. You see, I've discovered that Derek Hutchins has also been filing fraudulent expense reports. Michael Torres has been skimming money from the Employee Benefits Fund. And that's just what I found in the first hour of investigation. You can't fire them. They're executives. The board would have to approve. I am the board, Byron. Or at least, I control 73% of it. I can fire anyone I want, including you. The threat hung in the air between us. I could hear Byron breathing heavily, probably calculating how much he stood to lose if I followed through. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. Come home. We're going to have a very long conversation about the future of Morrison Family Enterprises. And Byron, bring Sandra with you. It's time the three of us had an honest discussion about accountability. I hung up before he could respond. Then I returned to my files, pulling out employment contracts and reviewing termination procedures. By the time Byron arrived home, I intended to have a very clear plan for dealing with everyone who had treated me like a fool, starting with the woman who had been sharing my husband's bed while spending my money. Byron arrived home 3 hours later with Sandra in tow. I watched from the upstairs window as they sat in his car for several minutes, clearly having an intense discussion before finally walking to the front door. Sandra looked nervous, constantly smoothing her black hair and adjusting her blazer. Byron looked like a man walking to his execution. I met them in the living room, where I'd arranged 3 chairs in a triangle. The furniture placement was deliberate. No one would be sitting together on the couch like allies. This was going to be a business meeting, not a social gathering. Please sit down, I said, gesturing to the chairs I'd selected. I'd chosen the highest one for myself, positioning it slightly forward so I would be looking down at both of them. Sandra perched on the edge of her chair like she might need to run at any moment. She kept glancing between Byron and me, clearly unsure of the protocol for this situation. How do you behave when meeting your lover's wife who also happens to be your ultimate boss? Before we begin, I said, opening the folder I'd prepared, I want to make something clear. This is not a personal conversation about marriage or relationships. This is a business meeting about employee misconduct and financial impropriety. I pulled out the first document and placed it on the coffee table where both could see it. Sandra, this is your employment contract, signed 15 years ago. According to this document, your starting salary was $32,000 annually. Can you tell me what your current salary is? Sandra's voice came out as barely a whisper. $95,000. $95,000, I repeated. That's an increase of nearly 200% over 15 years. Quite impressive for an administrative assistant. Tell me, what additional responsibilities have you taken on to justify such dramatic salary growth? She looked at Byron desperately, but he was staring at his hands. I've taken on more executive support duties, managing Byron's calendar, handling confidential correspondence, coordinating with department heads. Coordinating with department heads, I mused. Interesting, because according to the organizational chart, administrative assistants don't have authority to coordinate with department heads. That's a management-level responsibility. I pulled out another document. This is your most recent job description, dated 18 months ago. It lists your official duties as managing executive calendar, handling correspondence, filing, answering phones, and other duties as assigned. Nothing about department coordination or strategic planning. Sandra's face flushed red. Byron asked me to take on additional responsibilities. I'm sure he did. I turned to Byron, who finally looked up at me. Byron, as Sandra's supervisor, can you explain the business justification for giving her a $63,000 raise over 15 years for performing the same basic administrative functions? Byron opened his mouth, then closed it again. We all knew there was no legitimate business justification. I continued without waiting for his answer. Let me show you something else. I spread out the expense reports I'd discovered earlier. These are Sandra's travel expenses over the past 5 years. Notice anything interesting? Both of them leaned forward to look at the papers, though I suspect they already knew what I'd found. Every single business trip Sandra has taken coincides exactly with Byron's travel schedule. Same cities, same hotels, often consecutive room numbers. The company has been paying for 2 people to attend meetings that required only 1 employee. I pulled out more documentation. And then there are these expense reports. Dinners for 2 at romantic restaurants, charged as client entertainment but with no client names listed. Hotel spa services charged as business amenities. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany's categorized as corporate gifts, but never distributed to any actual clients or employees. Sandra was now visibly shaking. Byron looked like he might be sick. 15 years of fraudulent expense reports. I continued methodically. 15 years of unauthorized salary increases. 15 years of using corporate resources to finance a personal relationship. Do you understand the legal implications of what you've been doing? Mrs. Morrison, Sandra said, her voice trembling. I never meant for any of this to happen. Byron said it was all approved. He said you knew about the raises and that you were fine with our arrangement. I felt a cold smile cross my face. Our arrangement? Is that what he called it? Sandra nodded miserably. He said you and he had an understanding, that you were both mature adults who could handle a modern marriage. He said you were focused on your social activities and weren't interested in his personal life as long as he was discreet. I turned to Byron, who had gone completely pale. Is that what you told her? That I knew about your affair and approved of it? Byron's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Beulah, I can explain. Please do. I'm very interested to hear how you explained my approval of you embezzling company funds to finance your relationship with Sandra. I never said you approved of the expenses, Byron protested weakly. I said you weren't involved in the day-to-day business operations, that you trusted me to handle financial decisions, and the salary increases, the promotions, the forged authorization forms. Byron didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because we all knew he'd been lying to Sandra just as much as he'd been lying to me. I turned back to Sandra. Tell me, in 15 years of this arrangement, did Byron ever mention that I own 73% of Morrison Family Enterprises? Sandra's eyes widened. Own? I thought Byron's family owned the company. Byron's family did own the company. Past tense. I bought it in the 1980s to prevent it from going bankrupt. Every salary increase you've received, every fraudulent expense you've submitted, every unauthorized benefit you've enjoyed, it all came from my money. The silence in the room was deafening. Sandra looked like she was about to faint. Byron was staring at the floor as if he could will himself to disappear through it. So here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm and businesslike. Sandra, you have 2 choices. Option 1. I file criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. You'll be arrested, prosecuted, and likely spend several years in prison. You'll also be personally liable for repaying every penny of fraudulent expenses and unauthorized salary increases. Approximately $430,000 over 15 years. Sandra made a small choking sound. Option 2. You resign immediately, forfeit any severance pay or benefits, and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You'll also agree to repay the fraudulent expenses through a structured payment plan. In exchange, I won't pursue criminal charges. I can't pay back $400,000, Sandra whispered. The fraudulent expenses total approximately $87,000. That's what you'll be repaying. The unauthorized salary increases are my loss to absorb. I pulled out a pre-prepared resignation letter, an NDA. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to decide. If you choose option 2, sign these documents and leave your office keys and company credit card on my desk. If you choose option 1, I'll be contacting the police and the district attorney's office. Sandra took the papers with shaking hands. Can I think about it? You can think about it somewhere other than here. This meeting is over for you. Sandra looked at Byron one last time, but he didn't meet her eyes. She gathered her purse and left without another word. Once she was gone, I turned my full attention to Byron. Now then, I said, let's discuss your future with Morrison Family Enterprises. Byron finally looked up at me. What do you want, Beulah? What I want is for you to understand your new position in this company. You're no longer the president. You're no longer an executive. As of today, you're a mid-level employee with no authority to hire, fire, promote, or approve expenses. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You can continue working for Morrison Family Enterprises in a reduced capacity with appropriate supervision, or you can resign and face the same criminal charges I just offered Sandra. Byron's face went red. This is ridiculous. I built this company. I made it successful. You almost destroyed this company. I built it back up while you took credit for my work. For 42 years, I've been protecting your reputation and your family's legacy. That protection ends now. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Mrs. Patterson was still tending her roses. Tomorrow morning, I'll be announcing several organizational changes to the staff. Derek Hutchins will be terminated for expense fraud. Michael Torres will be transferred to a junior position pending investigation of the benefits fund irregularities. And you will be reassigned to a position more suited to your actual qualifications. What position? Byron asked through gritted teeth. I turned back to him with a smile that held no warmth. Regional Sales Coordinator. You'll report to Jennifer Walsh in the Southwest Division. Your starting salary will be $65,000 annually, with standard employee benefits and a company car appropriate to your new position. Byron shot to his feet. $65,000? That's less than half my current salary. That's more than you're worth, considering the criminal liability you've exposed the company to. And Byron? Jennifer Walsh is 28 years old. I hope you'll find her management style educational. The humiliation on Byron's face was perfect. After 42 years of being condescended to, dismissed, and publicly mocked, watching him realize that his career was now in the hands of a woman young enough to be his daughter felt like justice. You can't do this to me, he said desperately. I'm your husband. You were my husband when you laughed along with your colleagues calling me a failure. You were my husband when you forged my signature on authorization forms. You were my husband when you used my money to finance your affair. I walked past him toward the stairs. Being my husband didn't stop you from treating me like garbage. It's not going to save you now. As I climbed the stairs to my office, I heard Byron slam the front door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in decades, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning, I arrived at Morrison Family Enterprises at 7:30, 2 hours before the official start of business. I wanted to be settled in my new office, Byron's former office, before the chaos began. For 40 years, I had visited this building only for Christmas parties and retirement dinners, always as Byron's decorative wife. Today, I walked through the marble lobby as the owner and CEO. The security guard, Robert, did a double take when he saw me. Good morning, Mrs. Morrison. You're here early today. Good morning, Robert. I'll be working here regularly now, so please have a key card prepared for me with full building access. His confusion was evident, but he nodded professionally. Of course, ma'am. Should I let Mr. Morrison know you're here? Mr. Morrison is no longer in the executive suite. He'll be working in the Southwest Division under Jennifer Walsh's supervision. Robert's eyes widened, but he maintained his composure. I'll make note of that, ma'am. I took the elevator to the top floor, where Byron's corner office had been transformed overnight by the cleaning crew I'd hired. His personal items were packed in boxes by the door: golf trophies, family photos, the expensive scotch he kept for impressing clients. The desk was clear except for the company laptop I'd had IT prepare for me. At exactly 9 o'clock, my assistant knocked on the door. Not Sandra, obviously. I'd hired a replacement through a temp agency. Margaret was a 62-year-old woman with 30 years of experience working for female executives. She understood the importance of discretion and competence. Mrs. Morrison, the department heads are assembled in the conference room as requested. Thank you, Margaret. Please ask them to wait another 10 minutes. I want everyone to arrive before we begin. I used those 10 minutes to review my notes one final time. What I was about to announce would send shockwaves through the company, but it was necessary. Morrison Family Enterprises had been operating like a boys' club for too long, with mediocre men protecting each other while talented women were overlooked for promotions. The conference room fell silent when I entered. 12 department heads, 10 of them men, all staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed hostility. These were Byron's chosen allies, the ones who had laughed along with the humiliation at the anniversary party. I took my seat at the head of the table, the chair that had always been Byron's. Good morning, everyone. As you may have heard, there have been some organizational changes. I am now serving as CEO and president of Morrison Family Enterprises, effective immediately. Derek Hutchins, the VP of Operations who had started the mockery at the party, leaned forward aggressively. With all due respect, Mrs. Morrison, where is Byron? Shouldn't he be making this announcement? Mr. Morrison has been reassigned to a position more suited to his qualifications. He'll be working in regional sales under Jennifer Walsh's supervision. The room erupted in murmurs. Jennifer Walsh was one of our youngest department heads, a brilliant woman in her late 20s who had been consistently passed over for executive roles despite outperforming her male colleagues. This is absurd, Derek continued. You can't just waltz in here and start firing executives. The board of directors would never approve this. I smiled coldly. Mr. Hutchins, as the majority shareholder of this company, I am the board of directors. And speaking of firing executives, you're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out after this meeting. Derek's face went white, then red. You can't fire me. I have a contract. You had a contract. You violated it when you submitted fraudulent expense reports totaling over $37,000 in the past 3 years. Margaret has prepared your termination paperwork, along with documentation of your financial misconduct. I turned to the rest of the room. Mr. Torres, you're being transferred to accounts payable, where you'll work under direct supervision while we investigate irregularities in the Employee Benefits Fund. Your salary will be reduced to reflect your new position. Michael Torres, the man who had joked about me getting my nails done all day, looked like he was about to argue, then thought better of it when he saw Derek's panicked expression. Now then, I continued, let's discuss the future leadership structure of this company. Jennifer Walsh is being promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations, with authority over all regional sales divisions. Maria Santos will become VP of Finance, and Catherine Reed will head our new Strategic Development Department. The 3 women I'd named straightened in their chairs, clearly shocked but pleased. They were the most qualified people in the room, but under Byron's leadership, they'd been relegated to junior positions while less capable men were promoted. What about the rest of us? Asked James Parker, the head of manufacturing. The rest of you will continue in your current positions, assuming you can adapt to the new performance standards we'll be implementing. Merit-based promotions, transparent financial reporting, and zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Margaret will distribute new organizational charts and reporting structures this afternoon. Mr. Hutchins, please clean out your office immediately. Mr. Torres, report to Maria Santos at 1 o'clock for your reassignment briefing. As the room cleared, I noticed several of the male executives whispering angrily among themselves. They were probably planning some kind of rebellion, maybe threatening to quit in protest. I almost hoped they would. It would make the house cleaning easier. Jennifer Walsh lingered after the others left. Mrs. Morrison, I don't know what to say. Thank you for this opportunity. Don't thank me yet, Jennifer. You're about to have Byron Morrison reporting to you. I suspect he won't take kindly to having a boss who's younger than he is. Jennifer's smile was sharp and confident. I can handle Byron Morrison. I'm counting on it. The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Word of the changes spread quickly through the company, and I could feel the tension building as employees tried to process what was happening. At noon, Byron finally arrived. I watched through my office window as he stood in the parking lot for several minutes, staring up at the building like he'd never seen it before. When he finally came inside, he didn't come to my office. Instead, he went directly to the Southwest Division, where Jennifer Walsh was waiting for him. Margaret buzzed me 20 minutes later. Mrs. Morrison, there's some kind of commotion in the Southwest Division. Should I investigate? No need, Margaret. I suspect Mr. Morrison is discovering that his new position comes with actual accountability. Through the office grapevine, I learned what had happened. Byron had walked into Jennifer's office expecting to negotiate his way back to his executive position. Instead, Jennifer had handed him a stack of sales reports to review and a list of clients he needed to contact by the end of the week. When he'd protested that he didn't understand why he was being treated like an entry-level employee, Jennifer had calmly explained that his performance would be evaluated based on results, not tenure. The real confrontation came at 3 o'clock, when Byron finally stormed into my office without knocking. "This is insane, Beulah. You can't treat me like some junior employee. I built this company." "You nearly destroyed this company," I replied without looking up from the financial reports I was reviewing. "And if you continue to disrupt the workplace with emotional outbursts, I'll have security escort you out permanently. Jennifer Walsh is young enough to be my daughter. You expect me to take orders from her? I expect you to do your job." Jennifer Walsh has a master's degree in business administration and has consistently exceeded her performance targets for 5 years. She's eminently qualified to supervise regional sales. Byron slammed his hand on my desk. "What about loyalty? What about respect for everything I've given you?" I finally looked up at him, my expression ice cold. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? You stood in front of our colleagues and agreed that I was a useless failure. You laughed when they mocked me. You forged my signature on legal documents. You embezzled company funds to finance an affair. Tell me, Byron, which part of that behavior demonstrated respect?" His face went through several color changes as he struggled for a response. "I made mistakes, but this is humiliating." "Yes," I agreed. "It is humiliating. Now you know how I felt for 42 years. Byron stared at me for a long moment, then turned and stalked out of my office. Through my window, I watched him get into his car and drive away. He didn't return for the rest of the week. On Friday afternoon, Margaret brought me a resignation letter. Byron was quitting Morrison Family Enterprises, citing irreconcilable differences with new management. He was also filing for divorce, claiming I had fundamentally misrepresented myself during our marriage. I read the letter twice, then filed it in my desk drawer. After 42 years of marriage, Byron's departure should have felt like a devastating loss. Instead, all I felt was relief. That evening, I called my lawyer to discuss the divorce proceedings. Byron would probably try to claim half of everything, despite the fact that Morrison Family Enterprises had always been mine. He'd discover that I'd been more thorough in protecting my assets than he'd ever imagined. As I prepared to leave the office, I took one last look around the space that had been Byron's domain for so long. Tomorrow, I would start implementing the changes that would transform Morrison Family Enterprises into the company it should have been all along. A company where competence mattered more than gender, where financial integrity was non-negotiable, and where no one would ever again be dismissed as decorative. The little girl who had inherited $12 million at 24 had finally learned to use her power. And Byron Morrison was about to discover just how expensive his arrogance had been. 6 months after Byron's resignation, I stood in the same ballroom where my humiliation had begun, but this time as the keynote speaker for the Regional Women in Business Conference. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had been mocked as a useless failure was now being honored as Businesswoman of the Year. Morrison Family Enterprises had transformed dramatically under my leadership. Company profits had increased by 32%, employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, and we'd been featured in 3 major business publications as a model for progressive workplace policies. More importantly, I had transformed. The woman who once hid her intelligence behind a demure smile now commanded boardrooms with confidence. The wife who had swallowed humiliation for decades now spoke her mind without apology. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at the audience of successful women and a few enlightened men. 6 months ago, I was introduced to this community in a rather unconventional way. I was publicly mocked for being dependent on my husband's success. Tonight, I want to share what I learned from that experience. In the front row, I spotted several former Morrison employees who had attended out of curiosity. Jennifer Walsh sat with Maria Santos and Catherine Reed, the three women who had stepped into leadership roles and exceeded every expectation. Their presence gave me strength. For 42 years, I allowed others to define my worth. I pretended to be less capable than I was because I thought it would preserve my marriage and protect my husband's pride. What I didn't realize was that by diminishing myself, I was enabling a system that diminished all women. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. The night I revealed that I owned 73% of Morrison Family Enterprises, I wasn't just correcting a misconception about my role in the company. I was reclaiming my voice after decades of voluntary silence. And what I discovered was that silence is not golden, it's toxic. Applause rippled through the room, growing stronger as I continued. In the 6 months since taking active control of my company, I've learned that competence has no gender, vision has no age limit, and leadership is not about commanding respect through intimidation. It's about earning respect through integrity. I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The divorce proceedings had been brutal, with Byron's lawyers initially demanding half of everything. They'd been shocked to discover that the house, the cars, the vacation properties, everything they thought was Byron's, had been purchased with my money and titled in my name. Byron had walked away with his pension fund and the realization that he'd never actually owned anything except his own arrogance. Some of you may be wondering what happened to my former husband and the executives who thought it was appropriate to publicly humiliate a colleague's wife. I'm happy to report that accountability has consequences. More applause, this time with some knowing laughter mixed in. Byron Morrison now works as a regional sales manager for a small textile company in Ohio. His annual salary is approximately 1/10 of what he earned when he thought he was running my company. Derek Hutchins, the man who called me a failure, is currently appealing his conviction for fraud and embezzlement. And Michael Torres, who suggested I spent my days getting my nails done, is working as a junior accountant under the supervision of a very capable 26-year-old woman. The satisfaction in the room was palpable. These women understood the sweet justice of incompetent men finally facing consequences for their actions. But tonight isn't about revenge, it's about rebuilding. Morrison Family Enterprises now has a female-majority leadership team. We've implemented pay equity policies, promoted based on merit rather than networking, and created mentorship programs that support women at every level of their careers. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing the company's improved performance metrics. The results speak for themselves. When you create an environment where talent is recognized regardless of gender, when you eliminate the old boys club mentality, when you refuse to tolerate casual discrimination, extraordinary things happen. In the audience, I noticed an older woman in the third row who looked familiar. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Margaret Chen, Sandra's mother. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and when our eyes met, she nodded respectfully. Sandra herself had struggled after her termination. She'd eventually found work as an administrative assistant at a law firm, making less than half her fraudulent Morrison salary. She'd also been required to pay back the $87,000 in embezzled expenses, which would take her approximately 8 years at her current income level. Sometimes consequences take time to fully materialize, but they always come. The most important lesson I want to share with you tonight, I continued, is that it's never too late to stop hiding. For those of you who have been making yourselves smaller to accommodate others' insecurities, for those who have been accepting less than you deserve to avoid conflict, for those who have been silent when you should have been speaking, your time is now. The standing ovation began in the front row and spread throughout the ballroom. As I looked out at these powerful, accomplished women celebrating not just my success, but their own potential, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, pure joy. After the speech, I was surrounded by women wanting to share their own stories of workplace discrimination, hidden talents, and delayed recognition. A 60-year-old attorney told me about finally making partner after 30 years of being overlooked. A 55-year-old engineer described starting her own consulting firm after being passed over for promotion one too many times. A 48-year-old doctor explained how she'd stopped apologizing for her expertise and started demanding the respect she'd earned. Each story reminded me that my experience wasn't unique. Countless women had been told they were too much or not enough, too aggressive or too passive, too ambitious or not driven enough. The difference was that I'd finally had enough power to fight back effectively. As the evening wound down, I stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace, needing a moment of quiet reflection. The city lights sparkled below, and I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, silent, diminished, pretending to be grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. "Mrs. Morrison?" I turned to find a young woman, probably in her early 30s, approaching hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you. I work for a company where the CEO's wife is treated exactly the way you describe being treated. Everyone assumes she's just decorative, but I've seen her reviewing contracts and financial reports when she thinks no one is looking. Your speech tonight. I think she needs to hear your story." I smiled and handed her my business card. "Have her call me. Sometimes we all need permission to stop hiding." As I drove home to the house that had always been mine, but had never felt like home until Byron left, I reflected on the unexpected gift his cruelty had given me. If he hadn't humiliated me so publicly, so completely, I might have continued the charade for another decade. I might have died having never fully used my capabilities, never claimed my rightful place, never experienced the satisfaction of building something extraordinary. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with my own company waiting for my leadership. At 66 years old, I was finally living as myself, not as someone's wife, not as someone's assumption about what women should be, but as Beulah Morrison, CEO and majority owner of a $50 million enterprise. I poured myself coffee and opened my laptop to review the quarterly reports that Jennifer had prepared. Morrison Family Enterprises was thriving under authentic leadership, proving what I'd always suspected. Competence and integrity were far more valuable than networking and bluster. My phone rang as I was reviewing the numbers. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Beulah Morrison speaking. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Patricia Williams. I attended your speech last night. I own a small manufacturing company, and I wanted to discuss a potential partnership. I believe our companies could accomplish great things together." I smiled, opening my calendar to schedule the meeting. At 66, I was just getting started. The woman who had spent 42 years hiding her light under a bushel was finally ready to illuminate the world. And the best part? Byron Morrison, wherever he was selling textiles in Ohio, would read about every success in the business journals. He would know that the useless wife he'd discarded had built an empire without him. He would understand, finally, that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. The silent empire I'd built in secret was now a public testament to what happens when women stop apologizing for their excellence. And I had never been more proud to put my name on it. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.